Hollywood can polish a face until it looks almost untouchable, like porcelain under perfect light. But porcelain cracks, and in an industry obsessed with youth, control, and impossible beauty, some of the most admired Black female celebrities began chasing a more flawless version of themselves until the damage could no longer be hidden. What started as small cosmetic changes turned into swelling, stiffness, distorted features, and faces that no longer carried the softness, balance, or expression people once remembered. Tonight, we are looking at 9 women whose transformations revealed something far darker than vanity. Because in some of these stories, the real damage was never just physical. Before the surgeries, Lil Kim had the kind of face that could command a frame before she even opened her mouth. In the 1990s, she emerged as one of the most unforgettable women in hip-hop, not just because of her music, but because of how distinct she looked. Her beauty felt bold, glamorous, and unmistakably her own. With sun-kissed skin, strong Afrocentric features, and a sharp, confident presence, she became more than a rap icon. She became a symbol of power, sex appeal, and a version of Black female beauty that did not ask to be softened for anyone. Then that image began to shift. Over the years, Lil Kim became one of the most shocking examples of facial overtransformation in entertainment. Her appearance became tied to multiple rhinoplasties, jaw shaving, heavy fillers, and severe skin bleaching. The result was not subtle. Her bone structure appeared warped. Her cheeks looked unnaturally swollen. Her nose was reduced to a painfully pinched point, so narrowed that it no longer matched the rest of her face. The rich complexion and softer facial balance people remembered from her early years seemed to disappear under layers of alteration, leaving behind a look many viewers found startlingly unfamiliar. The darker part of her transformation was not just how different she looked, but how much of her original identity seemed to disappear with it. Her early face carried character, confidence, and a visual presence that felt unmistakably her own. By the time the changes became most extreme, that clarity had been replaced by something far more manufactured. The surgeries did not simply alter her appearance. They seemed to erase the signature that once made her instantly recognizable. In television, a face is never just a face. It becomes part of the performance, part of the connection, and sometimes the very thing that makes an audience trust what they are seeing. That is exactly why Wendy Williams made such a strong impression for so many years. Before her appearance became a talking point, she had one of those faces that could carry an entire segment on its own. A raised brow, a sharp look, a sudden smile. All of it felt immediate, readable, and completely alive. Combined with her fearless delivery and oversized personality, it helped turn her into one of the most recognizable women in daytime television. But the same industry that rewards visibility can also punish every sign of age. Wendy never really hid her relationship with cosmetic procedures. She was openly associated with surgical enhancement, and over time, that pursuit seemed to push her face beyond its natural limits. Repeated facelifts and brow lifts in a short span left her features pulled far too tight. Her brows appeared lifted so high that her eyes began to look permanently widened, almost frozen in a startled or angry expression. The tension in her face no longer looked temporary. It looked fixed. Her skin seemed overstretched, and the natural softness that once made her reaction so effective on camera was replaced by a harsher, more rigid appearance. Even her smile started to feel stiff, forced, and oddly disconnected, as though the muscles underneath could no longer settle into a natural expression. For someone like Wendy, that kind of change went far beyond appearance. A talk show host lives through timing, reaction, and facial expression, and those were some of the very things her audience responded to most. Once that movement started to look restricted, the shift became impossible to ignore. Instead of seeming refreshed, she often looked frozen inside the same face that had once helped her own the screen. There was a point when Blac Chyna's look felt less like a makeover and more like a brand. In her early rise, Angela White built an image that was impossible to ignore. She had a naturally youthful face, wide eyes, fuller features, and the kind of rebellious confidence that made her stand out in a culture already crowded with people trying to shock the public. Before the most extreme procedures, her beauty still carried softness. It still looked connected to a real person underneath the styling, the nightlife persona, and the tabloid spectacle. That was part of why her later transformation hit so hard. People were not just reacting to change, they were reacting to the feeling that her original face had been buried under something far more artificial. Over time, that transformation became harder to ignore. Her cheeks, lips, and jawline appeared increasingly shaped by heavy filler use, while the rest of her appearance was also tied to repeated body modifications. On her face, the effect no longer looked like enhancement. It looked like accumulation. Her cheeks appeared overly inflated. Her lips looked excessively filled. The jawline seemed more manufactured than naturally defined. At certain points, the whole face read as chronically puffy, overworked, and strangely stiff, as if too much volume had been forced onto features that once had far more softness and balance. The expression people used to recognize began to flatten under the weight of it. She later admitted that the modifications had started to make her look scary, and even worse, unfamiliar to herself. That is the point where the story stops feeling like celebrity excess and starts feeling more personal. By the time she began dissolving fillers and scaling back the more extreme procedures, the damage was already clear. The face that had once helped build the persona had been pushed so far that coming back started to look less like a beauty decision and more like an act of rescue. How many times can one feature be reshaped before the whole face starts losing its balance? With NeNe leaks, that question became harder to ignore over time. In her early years on reality television, she had a bold, mature beauty that felt completely natural to her presence. Her face looked strong, expressive, and balanced. Combined with her confidence, sharp humor, and unmistakable voice, it gave her the kind of screen presence that could dominate a scene without effort. She did not need refinement to stand out. She already looked like someone the camera would find. Then the pursuit of a more perfected version began to show. NeNe's changing appearance became most closely associated with repeated rhinoplasty. After the first nose job did not deliver the result she wanted, the bridge was narrowed again in a second attempt to create a slimmer look. That is where the transformation took on a harsher edge. Her nose began to look excessively refined compared to the rest of her facial structure, as if one feature had been sculpted toward a different face entirely. The narrowing did not simply change the silhouette. It disrupted the overall harmony of her expressions, especially when she smiled or spoke. Instead of blending naturally into her face, the nose started to draw attention to itself, making the whole look feel more altered than elegant. The most troubling part was that the damage was not purely cosmetic. The structural changes reportedly led to breathing difficulties, turning a beauty decision into a medical problem. That detail shifts the story in a darker direction. This was no longer just about public scrutiny or chasing a sharper profile. It became a case of physical comfort being traded for an aesthetic ideal that did not sit naturally on her face. NeNe remained open about the procedures, but openness did not soften the result. By then, the cost was already visible, in a face that looked less at ease every time it tried to move. A face can hold on to beauty for years, but the moment it starts fighting time too hard, something else begins to slip away. Faith Evans once had the kind of presence that made elegance look effortless. In the height of her career, she was not just admired for her voice. She was admired for the calm warmth in her face, the balanced features, the easy smile, and the quiet confidence that made her beauty feel mature rather than manufactured. She looked like someone completely at home in her own skin, and that natural ease became part of how the public saw her. That is why the later changes felt so uncomfortable to watch. As the pressure to stay youthful tightened around her image, her appearance began shifting into something visibly less relaxed. Heavy Botox and fillers seemed to alter the way her face settled in public, and the effect was hard to miss. At certain appearances, her face looked unusually frozen, almost as if the skin had stopped moving in sync with the emotion underneath it. Her eyes appeared more slanted than before, giving her expression a strained quality that did not belong to the softer version people remembered. The delicacy in her features began to give way to stiffness. Even her smile, once so open and natural, started to look tight and slightly distorted, as though too much tension had been introduced for the expression to land the way it once did. The sad part is that nothing about Faith Evans ever needed drastic reinvention. Her face had always carried its own kind of grace. But once cosmetic correction started leaning too far into control, that grace became harder to see. What had once felt warm and harmonious began to look chemically managed, as if the fear of aging had slowly crowded out the very softness that made her beautiful in the first place. By the time the imbalance became visible, the real loss was no longer youth. It was ease. Not every transformation announces itself with one shocking before and after. Sometimes the change sits in the background first, showing up in moments when a face no longer rests the way it used to. Kelly Rowland had long been associated with a very different kind of image. She was known for beauty that looked clean, balanced, and effortless, the kind that did not need exaggeration to register. Her features were harmonious, her complexion was rich and radiant, and her smile carried the kind of poise that made her seem naturally composed in any setting. She looked polished without ever seeming overworked, and that quiet balance became part of her appeal. That is why even subtle shifts around her face drew attention. Behind that image was a much older insecurity. Kelly later spoke openly about thinking about altering her body when she was still very young, which gives the story a more vulnerable core than it first appears to have. By the time cosmetic intervention entered the picture, the issue no longer seemed to be beauty itself, but the pressure to perfect it. Public speculation around facial changes centered on fillers and rhinoplasty, with the suggestion that dissatisfaction with early results may have led to repeated adjustments. At certain points, her face appeared to move through phases that looked stiffer and less natural than before. The softness that once held everything together seemed reduced. Instead of resting easily, some expressions began to look more controlled than felt, as if the face had been nudged away from its original ease in the pursuit of something more precise. That is where Kelly Rowland's story becomes more unsettling than dramatic. It is not built around a single extreme outcome, but around the idea that even someone who already looked complete could still be made to feel unfinished. The public saw elegance. The mirror may have been asking for corrections. And once that cycle begins, it rarely stays as small as it started. In Kelly's case, the face never lost all of its beauty. What changed was the sense that it had once belonged entirely to itself. Some beauty decisions sound small when they are first described. A different color, a new look, a feature made more striking than before. But with Tiny Harris, the choice that changed everything was never truly small. Before that gamble, her face had a sweetness people remembered instantly. In the 1990s, she was known for a petite, expressive look, dark eyes full of warmth, and a smile that brought softness to her image even when the spotlight around her grew louder. There was something naturally bright about the way she looked. The eyes, especially, made her feel present. They gave her face life. That is why what happened next feels so extreme. Wanting a more unusual appearance, Tiny chose to permanently change her eye color from dark brown to ice gray through artificial iris implant surgery, a procedure so controversial it was not approved in the United States. The decision alone already carried a sense of danger, but the aftermath made it far worse. The procedure reportedly led to severe vision complications and dangerously high pressure inside the eyes. And once that happened, the change was no longer cosmetic. It became visible in a way that unsettled people immediately. Her eyes began to look glassy, unnatural, and emotionally distant, stripped of the warmth that had once made her face feel so alive. The more the new color stood out, the less the expression underneath seemed to connect. Instead of looking striking, the result often felt medically wrong, as if the attempt to create something unforgettable had replaced a living gaze with something colder and far harder to read. She eventually had to undergo corrective treatment just to manage the complications and protect her eyesight. That detail shifts the entire story into darker territory. This was not a case of someone chasing sharper contours or a younger face. It was a case of beauty pushing toward physical risk in one of the most sensitive parts of the body. Long after the novelty wore off, the eyes still carried the cost of that decision. Some cosmetic damage does not show up all at once. It builds underneath the surface, quietly at first, until the face starts carrying signs that can no longer be explained away. That slow unraveling is part of what made Moniece Slaughter's story so disturbing. In her earlier years on reality television, she had a look that felt sharp, youthful, and naturally striking. Her features were balanced, her beauty still carried softness, and there was an edge to her presence that made her stand out without needing anything excessive. She looked camera-ready in a way that still felt like her. Then the pursuit of refinement turned into something far harder to control. Over time, Moniece admitted to relying heavily on fillers in her lips and cheeks, expecting the changes to remain temporary and manageable. Instead, the material reportedly stayed in place, hardened, and began creating lumps beneath the skin. What had been intended as enhancement started to read as visible damage. Her face appeared swollen, uneven, and stripped of its natural symmetry. The cheeks no longer looked softly contoured. They looked burdened, as if something unnatural had settled under the skin and refused to leave. The lips and midface lost their balance. Rather than making her look fresher, the procedures seemed to blur the very structure that had made her features attractive in the first place. At that point, the issue was no longer about volume. It was about deformation. What makes Moniece's case so difficult to shake is the way the correction itself became part of the horror. Removing the filler was not a simple reversal. It involved painful surgery to cut into facial tissue and scrape out hardened material that had formed inside. That detail changes the entire tone of the story. The danger was not only in looking different, it was in realizing that something placed there for beauty had turned into something her face had to be rescued from. By then, the damage was no longer superficial. It had gone beneath the skin, and the recovery had to follow it there. A face can survive a lot and still hold on to its balance. But once the damage reaches the features that frame the eyes, even small changes can throw everything off. Meagan Good built much of her screen presence on that balance. From her early work onward, she had the kind of beauty people described as effortless, not because it was plain, but because nothing about it looked forced. Her complexion was smooth, her features were naturally harmonious, and her eyes carried a softness that made even strong expressions feel inviting. She did not look overly designed. She looked complete. That is part of what made the damage around her brows so unsettling. In her younger years, Meagan chose permanent eyebrow tattoos, a decision that sounded cosmetic and convenient at the time. But as the years passed, the pigment reportedly changed, the area became damaged, and the situation escalated beyond a beauty mistake. The skin around the brows was left visibly compromised, and the symmetry of her face started to suffer with it. Brows do more than frame the eyes. They shape emotion, balance, and the way the whole upper face reads on camera. Once that area was thrown off, the change affected far more than one detail. Instead of clean definition, there was distortion. Instead of structure, there was visible disruption. The face still looked like Meagan Good, but one of its most delicate anchors had been damaged enough to alter the overall impression. Correcting it required far more than makeup or touch-ups. She eventually underwent an eyebrow transplant, a painstaking procedure that involved taking hair follicles from the back of the neck and placing them into the brow area to rebuild a more natural shape. That kind of correction says everything about how serious the damage had become. By then, the issue was no longer convenience. It was recovery. What began as a beauty shortcut turned into a surgical attempt to restore something her face had once carried effortlessly. In her case, the warning did not come from dramatic excess. It came from underestimating how permanent one small decision could become. Taken together, these stories were never just about cosmetic procedures going wrong. They were about what happens when fame, insecurity, aging, and public pressure all begin to shape the same face at once. In different ways, each of these women ended up confronting the same illusion that beauty can be controlled, corrected, or preserved indefinitely without cost. But the deeper truth is harder than that. The more the face is treated like a problem to solve, the easier it becomes to lose the very character that made it memorable in the first place. And in Hollywood, that loss rarely stays private for long. Some tried to reverse the damage, some learned to live with it. But together, these transformations reveal a darker pattern behind celebrity culture, where the pressure to remain desirable can quietly become more destructive than aging itself. Which story stayed with you the most? And if you want more documentaries that look past the glamour and into what fame really does to people, stay with us.